This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 74 of Here's How for the 26th of June 2018. In our nearest neighbour, pro-Brexit arguments do not have a reputation for intellectual rigour. So in this podcast, I'm talking to one of the few well-qualified academics who favours Brexit.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
You'll remember that in the last podcast I was talking to Steve Hinks from the British anti-vaccine group the UK Association of HPV Vaccine Injured Daughters about the Gardasil vaccine, and I've been in email contact with him since then. Steve is a gentleman, and he's sent me a lot of information along with his analysis of it. Some of the information is correct and relevant, but in almost every case, his analysis is flawed. I'm going to cover just a couple of points. I made the point in the last podcast that in the UK and Ireland, any supposed victims of Gardasil could sue for damages in the courts, as frequently happens with people who suffer medical accidents or negligence. It's notable that in both the UK and Ireland, where the standard of proof is the balance of probabilities, that's 51%, much lower than in a criminal trial, not a single person of the supposed hundreds represented by Regret and by Steve's organisation have even attempted a lawsuit, let alone been successful. Steve countered this with a reference to a US case where, he said, the court had ruled that it was proven that the vaccine had caused harm. He's just plain wrong. The case he referred to was in the United States Court of Federal Claims, Office of Special Masters. The US does not operate a common law system for people who say they were harmed by a vaccine. For good or ill, the US has a system where people who can show that they've suffered an illness are not required to show what caused the illness. The system is basically a bargain to prevent expensive lawsuits. Sick people can get financial help, but far less than they would get in a lawsuit, and they don't have to prove the case. That's specifically stated in the document that Steve sent me, so I find it startling that he takes the view that this shows that the court found that the cause was proven. Also in the last podcast, Steve said that the Ontario Department of Health study, which tracked hundreds of thousands of girls who got the vaccine and found that they had no more illnesses than is normal in the population, Steve said that this study was flawed. You might remember that I fact-checked this. I checked the scientific websites, and not a single scientific objection has been raised against this study. In his email, Steve changed tack a little. He acknowledged that there was no scientific objection, but said that he personally didn't like the study, and that's why he thought it was flawed. That's just not how science works. Like I said in the last podcast, scientists have to present their work and have it analysed. It's all done in public. And objections must be done in public and open to scientific analysis too. You can't just say, I don't like these results, so I'm going to decide that they're flawed. Finally, Steve talked about an Alberta, Canada study, which again followed up hundreds of thousands of girls who got the vaccine and investigated every hospital and emergency department visit that they had in the 6 weeks after they got the vaccination. That's how much these things are checked out. And what this study discovered was that there were about 19,000 emergency department visits within 6 weeks of getting a vaccine. But the flaw in Steve's thinking is to imagine that every teenager who sprains an ankle or is involved in a car accident or some other mishap, if they've been vaccinated, then it must be the vaccine what done it. That's nonsense. the rate of going to the emergency department for those teenagers is once in every 164 weeks. That's more than 3 years. That's just being a teenager. Teenagers visit the emergency department 2 or 3 times in their teenage years on average. That has nothing to do with getting a vaccination, which is exactly what the authors said in their conclusion. Rates of adverse events after HPV immunization in Alberta are low and consistent with types of events seen elsewhere. There was also one other comment on a Reddit thread about the podcast, and the writer wrote, "People seem to forget that the swine flu vaccine caused narcolepsy not too long ago. I'm all for well-tested ones, but that vaccine ruined people's lives." And the writer referenced an issue with the Pandemrix vaccine. And they're right. That vaccine is no longer recommended for children because it was found to be associated with narcolepsy, a sleep disorder. And that case proves how wrong the anti-vaxxers are. Why? Because the monitoring system that looks out for adverse reactions to drugs worked. That vaccine was withdrawn for children because of one case of narcolepsy in 20,000 uses of the vaccine. The clinical trials before a drug is released might test 10,000 or 20,000 people. So you can see how one case in 20,000 might be missed in the statistical noise. But after the drug is released, hundreds of thousands, or in this case millions of people, are followed up, and that level of adverse events, one case in 20,000, over what would be expected in a normal population, was picked up. And on that basis, the vaccine was withdrawn for children. Now compare that to the claim by Anna Cannon of Regret that one girl in 30, not one in 30,000, one in 30, suffers severe life-altering side effects.
So, we know that most of the safety studies are done based on the manufacturer's own trials and own research. And if you look at Merck's own trials, in 2010, 1 in 30 displayed serious adverse events, and they would be very serious. It would be long-term health impairment, hospitalisation long-term, wheelchair for life, death, birth defects, and so on.
Is it seriously plausible that a monitoring system that picks up a problem at a rate of 1 in 20,000 cannot detect much more serious symptoms that happen to one girl in 30?
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Okay, that's all about vaccines for a while. I promise to go on to other topics, but I want to have time to research them in depth. That's why I've set up a Patreon account. It's basically a totally voluntary way to make a small donation to support the podcast, and I hope to get it to a level that would justify me devoting more time to regularly research and produce the podcast to a high quality. Think of it as penance for having to pay your TV license. If you can make a small contribution, then please go to www.here'show.ie and follow the links to sign up. Also, by the way, in this interview coming up, the Skype line got a bit ropey and I switched to the phone in the middle of it. I hope that doesn't disturb the interview too much. On the line now, I have Graham Gudgeon. Graham is an associate at the Centre for Business Research at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. He's also the Chief Economic Advisor at the Policy Exchange think tank in London. And for Irish people, probably most interestingly, he was a special advisor to the First Minister of Northern Ireland for economic policy from 1998 to 2002. Graham, you set up a group called Briefings for Brexit. When did you do that and what's it for?
Yeah, we set this website up at the beginning of this year, end of January. Mm-hmm. And I did this in conjunction with Professor Robert Toombs, who's a professor of history at St John's College, Cambridge. Mm-hmm. We set this up for a number of reasons. The main reason was to give an outlet to the work writings of senior academics who are pro-Brexit. Mm-hmm. We thought that those got very little coverage.
I've seen you interviewed a couple of times since, and one of the things that you said a few times is that you want to present high quality arguments in favour of Brexit. Why do you think that the arguments in favour of Brexit have been of such a low quality up to now?
Well, it's that the high quality arguments are just not getting much exposure. Mm-hmm. I mean, a good deal of the broadsheet press, that might take notice of this, or the BBC, tends to have either strong Remainer, strong anti-Brexit views, or mildly anti-Brexit views.
Really?
The Financial Times, for instance, which is where I might expect some of my economic writings or letters to be published.
Sure, they're certainly strongly anti-Brexit, but it's a very small circulation. Like the biggest broadsheet in the UK is the Daily Telegraph. You'd hardly call them being anti-Brexit. They're very strongly pro-Brexit.
They are. They are, yeah. But say for an economist like myself, I'd expect to get slightly technical articles into the Financial Times or perhaps the Economist magazine, mm-hmm. And that's not possible.
Do you think that's telling you something, that the Financial Times and other respected organs like the Economist magazine, do you think that's telling you something, that they're so anti-Brexit?
Yeah, well, it of course tells us something, but what it mainly tells us is that they're very pro-business, and there's a business interest in this which isn't fully coincident with the interests of the country at large. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the big problems with Brexit. That what's good for companies, and particularly good international companies, isn't necessarily good for the whole country, and particularly the labour force.
That's strongly in contrast with what a lot of conservative-leaning people would have thought for the past 20 or 30 years.
Sorry, are you asking there about the? Are we still talking about the slant of newspapers, or
not so much? But you said that there's a divergence in the interests of business and the interests of the country. Anybody who grew up under Margaret Thatcher would have thought that would have heard non-stop that those two were the same thing.
Yes, indeed, a lot of people. I mean, particularly free marketeers tend to have that view. Mm-hmm. But really what's happened in Brexit, and indeed what's happened in Trump's election in the US, shows, I think, a reaction against that view, and a view that a lot of people haven't gained from the move to free market globalization and membership of free trade organizations like the EU. Mm-hmm. I mean, let me give you one very clear example, one important example for Brexit, mm-hmm. and that's the importance of migration. Now, in the UK, many companies have found it profitable and helpful to employ large numbers of East Europeans. The East Europeans that they're employing tend to have good work motivation. They're often rather better educated than the average in the UK. So they're mm-hmm. attracting the better educated, perhaps half of people from Poland and other East European countries, and they're willing to work at something close to minimum wage. So this is very good for a lot of companies, and a lot of companies are therefore going straight. I mean, they go to employment agencies, which then go straight to Eastern Europe. In many cases, not even advertising jobs in the UK, so mm-hmm. bypassing the local labour force. But most worrying, there's been something like a halving of expenditure on training by UK companies over the last 10 or 15 years. So we can see what's happening. It's been good for companies to bring in this good quality labour force from Eastern Europe, bypass, as perhaps often less well educated, less well motivated local workforce. Mm-hmm. Don't spend the money training them. So good for companies, good for their shareholders, but not very good particularly for the less well-educated half of the UK labour force.
Are you sure that's the case? Because, for example, the National Union of Farmers in the UK has been very vocally very worried about the potential lack of Eastern European workers for jobs, agricultural jobs like fruit picking and so forth. Are you sure that unemployed British people can be quite so easily moved into those positions?
No, they can't. I mean, that's one of the factors here, particularly in agriculture and food processing. and a few other occupations, that the companies say, and one has to believe them here, that if they do advertise, they get very few applicants, or the quality of applicants isn't very good. Mm-hmm. But it then becomes a matter of wage levels. I mean, what they're really saying is, look, we can't attract indigenous British labour at the wages we pay and the conditions of work that apply in that industry. In some cases, I think if we were to make it much more difficult for East Europeans to come to the UK, then some activities would cease altogether. I mean, let's say the growing of leeks or something like that, fairly labour intensive, agricultural activities. What would happen then is that the leeks would be grown in Eastern Europe and would be imported into the UK, mm-hmm. and the farmers would then be using their land for something else. There would be a change around.
That doesn't sound to me like an enormous economic advantage for the UK.
Well, agriculture is a very small industry, really. It's only about 1% of UK output, so that's not a very big example.
That's true, but it's a very much more significant employer of Eastern European labour.
Yes, it is, and food processing is another one, particularly in Northern Ireland. I haven't checked this figure myself, but the figure I've heard is that something like 40% of all employees in the manufacturing sector in Northern Ireland were now born outside the UK. Not just born outside Northern Ireland, but born outside the UK. So there's been quite a big change in labour markets.
I don't want to get hugely into that detail. I appreciate what you're saying, but taken in the round as a whole, do you really believe that the UK will be economically better off post-Brexit than it would have been if it had remained in the EU?
Eventually, yes. Certainly not immediately.
How long is eventually?
Well, we're probably better off now than we would have been because of the depreciation of sterling. For instance, we model this, and we have macroeconomic forecasting model, and we can run it sort of just for the listeners. You mentioned the depreciation of sterling. Basically, the pound sterling crashed more or less just after the Brexit vote by about 15%, and it stayed down. That's the market expressing an opinion on the future prospects of the British economy, isn't it? Well, partly, but we would have regarded sterling as being overvalued before the Brexit referendum.
Sure, but you do understand that Brexiteers saying that the pound collapsing by 15% was really quite a startling amount in a very short period of time, and staying down. That means the markets think that the British economy will be that much weaker because of Brexit. That's hardly something to be crying about for a Brexiteer, is it?
Well, if, like us, myself and colleagues, you take the view that the pound sterling was previously overvalued, then a devaluation is beneficial, and it has been beneficial. We think GDP in the UK is now higher, not very much higher, but something like 0.5%, something like that. But somewhat higher. Anyway.
That's because you can sell things better abroad because they appear to be cheaper to foreign currency buyers.
That's right.
And conversely, products brought into the UK appear to be more expensive, so the British consumer has to essentially pay for that.
That's right, and to some extent, British producers will outcompete imports.
But that's an effect that will fade because eventually that flip in the price will just work its way through the market, and everybody will price their products and their labour and so forth, taking that dip in value of the pound sterling into account.
Well, if companies adjust their prices, then they're adjusting their profits as well. But so far, it looks as if exports have become very much more profitable, exports from the UK. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why the UK stock market has done very well.
But again, in the long term, that's not exactly something to crow about, because what's happening there is that the pound with which those companies are paying their workers is worth less, and it buys fewer imported products.
Yes.
So you've had a net switch of advantage from UK workers in exporting industries to the businesses, to the corporations.
You were asking me about the timing of benefits and losses. So I started with the short term.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
And that's what I'm talking about. And you're immediately switching to the long term. So
tell us about the long term then.
Yeah, if I could take it bit by bit. So in the short term, our view is that we're probably somewhat better off. That's not the Bank of England's view, by the way. Which the Bank of England's view is that each household is £900 a year worse off now than they would have been without the Brexit referendum.
Mm-hmm.
We don't agree with that. We think the average household is slightly better off, not.
In 2016, just before the Brexit vote, amongst the G7, the UK had the highest rate of economic growth. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And now it has the lowest.
Yes, but there's a timing of cycles in that.
To be honest, I'm most interested in the long-term benefits, and you were going to move on to that.
Then we move towards actually leaving. It looks as if we're going to leave the EU now in 2021, the transition period. And then there's a great deal of uncertainty about what sort of agreements are reached. My view all along has been we will almost certainly get a free trade agreement, which is in both in the interest of the UK and of the EU. Mm-hmm. And of course is absolutely vital to Ireland. A free trade agreement is more important to Ireland than to any other country, including the UK. And if I may just say so, just a slight tangent here, it's always been very puzzled that the Irish government has said so little about free trade agreements, and yet they must get one. So I assume this is a sort of stitch up between Dublin and Brussels, where Brussels says to Dublin, whatever you do, don't say anything about a free trade agreement because we're not talking about trade at this point. And Dublin has played along with that. The reality must be that Dublin will at some point push very hard for a free trade agreement when we finally get to that point.
I just want to pause you on that one point. We've heard really quite often from Brexiteers about how they expect the cavalry to be coming, whether it's Italian Prosecco producers or German car unions. We've been hearing for quite a while that somebody is going to come around the corner and tell the EU to be nice in their negotiations to the UK. That hasn't happened yet, has it?
No, there's been, both impressive discipline, I think, among the EU 27, including Ireland, on this, and that discipline is obviously coordinated by the Commission, by Juncker and Barnier, and co.
Oh, do you have evidence of that, or are you just assuming?
Well, it's my detailed reading of what's happening here. I mean, certainly the discipline is very impressive. There's been no break of discipline among the EU 27, with governments coming out and saying to Barnier, look, get on with it, Barnier. Let's move quickly to a free trade agreement, because it's in the interest of our companies. Mm-hmm. And of course, Ireland, Leo Varadkar and Simon Coveney have not done that at all. Although they must recognise how important this is to their countries, and particularly in the Irish case. But you're quite right. They haven't been pushing. And I've been astounded really with. To hear interviews with people like the president of the German Automotive Manufacturers Association saying he doesn't care about a free trade agreement. It's the future of the EU that really matters. Now, I might expect a German politician to say that, but to hear the president of the automotive manufacturers say it is to me rather weird and wonderful. So look. There's a matter of vested interest in this, and it's in everybody's interest to have a free trade agreement. And if the EU has free trade agreements with Canada...
That's true, Graham. It is in everybody's interest to have a free trade agreement, but it is much more in the UK's interest, isn't it? The one being cut off from the 27 is much more interested in that than the 27 being cut off from the one. I'm reminded of perhaps an apocryphal headline in the Times from 100 years ago or so that said, fog on the channel, France completely cut off. France doesn't seem to be too worried about that.
Yeah, the quote was continent cut off rather than just France, but which strengthens the point you're making. It depends whether you look at it proportionally or not. I mean, the amount of trade that's done between the UK and the EU is proportionately more important to the UK than the EU. Mm-hmm. But in terms of actual money, the EU is likely to lose more money than the UK because the UK runs a very large trade deficit with the EU. And certain sectors like German car manufacturers, stand to lose, quite a lot here. And one would be expecting them to be leaning on their own government to make sure that there is a free trade agreement. And I still expect that will happen.
Well, okay. Can I just challenge you on that a little bit? And you said German car manufacturers. I would suggest to you that there's no such thing as a German car manufacturer anymore. There's no car is made anywhere. Every car is made everywhere, and no matter what the mark on the front of the bonnet of the car that you buy, the components in that car are made in countries right across the EU. That's true, isn't it?
I don't know what proportion of German cars are depending on imports to Germany of car components. I'd expect that to be rather low, actually.
Oh, I'd have thought all of them.
No.
You think everything inside a Mercedes is made in Germany?
Well, I thought quite a lot of it was, but I don't actually have the figures to hand. Do you?
I don't have the figures to hand, but I do know that there's an enormous integrated trade between the various second-tier suppliers. So whatever about where it's made, everything inside a Mercedes or whatever car brand is not made by Mercedes. It's made by companies that they contract out to, or companies that those companies contract out to, and that creates a very, very complex ecosystem of suppliers which crosses borders left, right and centre. And I will get the reference, I don't have it to hand, but one particular engine component, I think it was BBC highlighted that particular component during its manufacture crossed the channel 5 times. We just don't live in the world whereby you have an English car that's made in England or a German car that's made in Germany anymore, do we?
Well, look, there's no point in either of us pursuing this since we don't have the figures to hand.
No, but the figures aren't irrelevant. The fact is that all of those companies are interdependent.
No, they're not interdependent to the extent that you're suggesting. Look, the figures we do have are that the EU 27 export far more goods to the UK than go the other way. Even if things have gone backwards and forwards,
that's true, Graham. But are you sure that's an advantage for the UK? Is the UK in a position either to do without all of those imports, or immediately replace them with home-sourced products?
No, the point I'm making is that if in extremis we went to a no-deal scenario, and the EU external tariffs were imposed on UK exports, and the UK retaliated with the same tariffs the other way, then there would be a 10% tariff on cars, for instance.
Which would be paid by UK consumers.
Which would have a notable effect on German exports. And one would expect those German car companies to put pressure on their own government to do something about that. The point I was going to make was that I've talked a bit to Australian trade negotiators, and they've got decades of experience of negotiating with the EU. And the point they make is, look, the EU are very tough negotiators. They use, rather rough language, as we've seen, of magical thinking and delusional and all the rest of it. But all that matters in these negotiations is the last 3 weeks, and just wait for that. So we shall see in this. I mean, we're certainly in a tough negotiating stage at present when nobody's giving any ground at all. But it will all be sorted out quite late in the stage.
How late is late?
Last 3 weeks.
Last 3 weeks before the UK leaves the EU?
No, in the last 3 weeks of the trade negotiations. So you may be correct that the EU will, bite off its own nose to spite its face and say that the survival of the EU is more important than trade negotiations, and that EU companies can lose competitiveness, they can lose market share in the UK, and that they won't do a free trade agreement with the UK, even though they're quite willing to do free trade.
But Graham, they could be making an entirely rational decision that, for example, it's better to focus on economic growth in Eastern Europe than it is to focus on the UK.
It would seem very odd that the EU is willing to have, not willing, but actually anxious to have free trade agreements with Canada, South Korea, Japan, finishing many other countries, but not have a free trade agreement with their biggest trade partner, the UK. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a fair assumption that we will end up with a free trade agreement. Although the present stage of negotiations are fairly hard-going and fairly tough.
It's a fair assumption that might happen. That sounds like if I was a betting person, I wouldn't bet the farm on it.
Well, I'll wager £1,000 with you if you want, but.
I will see what the exact terms of that particular wager are before I take it up. But one thing that you mentioned there, you said that Australia has decades of experience in negotiating with the EU. That means that after decades, it hasn't been concluded, or at least after one decade. That's really in contrast with what a lot of the Brexiteers said that could be, negotiated in a couple of weeks.
Well, look, if we're talking about a free trade agreement with the EU, this would be the only free trade agreement, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world ever that's been negotiated between two countries or organisations that already have free trade. Mm-hmm. So really, all the difficult things in a free trade agreement aren't there at all. What normally takes time in a free trade agreement is that there are losers on both sides, and those industries and trade associations and companies who are going to lose out of it, put a lot of pressure on their governments not to go down that route. Yeah,
so the lawnmower widget industry on one side doesn't want to be exposed to cheap imported lawnmower widgets, so they twist the arm of their government to not allow lawnmower widgets to be included in the free trade deal, and you have to then go down through every single item of manufacturing and try to get a deal signed off on each one of them.
And in the World Trade Organization classifications of goods, so there's an awful lot of things that can go wrong and cause difficulties. But in this case, uniquely, it would be a negotiation between two areas that already have free trade.
Well, that begs the question. Why are we doing it in the first place?
Why is the UK doing it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, not largely for trade reasons. And there are two main reasons. One is migration. Mm-hmm. If only the EU would have taken migration out of the single market for freedoms, then I think it's almost certain that the UK would have continued. That's continued as a member of the EU. So it's the EU's insistence that you can't have a free market, you can't have a single market without the free movement of labour. I don't think there's any economic reason for that. It's political, but anyway, that's one of the four freedoms and one of the red lines of the EU single market. Mm-hmm. So that's the main reason, biggest single reason, I think, why Brexit won the referendum.
I think you might be right, but Graham, on that...
I was going to give you a second one as well, if you want.
Well, pause for a moment on that, because what really brings you to believe that the EU will agree to a deal with 3 out of 4 and allow the UK to pass on the fourth?
Sorry, nothing makes me think that. We know that the EU is not willing to do that, and that's why we're leaving.
Sure, but leaving to circumvent that, you're not going to get the other 3 outside if you're not going to get it inside, are you?
Just want a free trade agreement. It's the same as Canada or South Korea. They're not members of the EU single market or customs union or anything else. They're just a free trade agreement like anybody else.
Okay. Let me just go to practicality then. You'll be aware of this often cited Nissan car plant in Sunderland. This plant brings 200,000 components into the UK for every hour that it operates. And this works on what's called a just-in-time delivery system. And what that means is that they don't have any space to store stuff. They rely on the truck with the parts showing up exactly at the time that they need them, not an hour early, not an hour late. Is that going to be compatible with a customs regime in Dover?
If the EU wants to cut up rough on this and make things difficult, I mean, no difficulties will be made on the UK side, and the technology is all there to allow everything to roll off or roll on or roll off the ferries quickly.
The customs regime is such that nobody would run a just-in-time operation importing parts from Canada.
I'm not sure about that. There may well be parts from South Korea and Japan, but I just don't know. But it's a fair point for you to raise. I think the car manufacturers and the aircraft manufacturers are playing a big, under the radar role on the British side of negotiations. They've obviously got a line into 10 Downing Street, and as far as we can tell, they seem to be relatively satisfied. I mean, all of the major car manufacturers in the UK have made major new investments in the UK since the Brexit referendum. So they've had various promises and undertakings, not all of which I think have been made public. But you're quite right to say that to run a just-in-time operation will need fairly free and unimpeded movement across the Channel. The British Ports Authority, which doesn't include Dover, and I think doesn't include Holyhead either, but includes most of the other ports, say that they will be fully ready for any eventuality. No problem as far as they're concerned. One worry from the British side is Dover, and as far as I can see, that the technology is all available to run this, but it really depends on cooperation on the other side of the Channel as well.
Why do you think the Dutch are hiring hundreds and hundreds more customs officers?
Well, because there'll be customs declarations, but they are doing it, and they know what is needed, and they'll be ready for the changes when they come. Same on the British side. So there's an undoubted cost on either side. But the question you raised about just-in-time operations is really a matter of whether there'll be significant hold-ups. Now, some companies are anticipating that that's possible. I mean, they just don't know at present. So a number of companies are buying space to build warehouses, so that they will actually they will store components on this side of the Channel, just in case. But I don't see any reason why there's any need to stop.
The other thing they could do is just move their production across the Channel. Yeah,
they're not saying that. As I said, all the big car companies have made major investments in the UK over the last 18 months. They prefer to stay here. What they have said, actually, is that they may need to source the components from this side of the Channel rather than the other side of the Channel if there's problems. But the likelihood of problems is much lower than you anticipate. I mean, in Ireland, for which we have figures, for instance, only 1% of any goods coming into Ireland, or only 1% of consignments or containers are ever stopped or searched. Everything else just
coming from where into Ireland?
Anywhere.
Yes, but typically the overwhelming majority of them are coming from other EU countries.
But the only things that need checking is trade from outside the EU. That's where the 1% is. Okay. Only 1% of goods coming into Ireland from outside the EU are currently checked, and that's a pattern that we see in most countries. Very, very few consignments are ever checked, and nearly all of the checks are done on intelligence. The police get a tip-off, or the customs authorities get a tip-off that there are drugs involved. For instance, I was at the port of Bristol a few weeks back, and they told me that in the last 2 years, the last 24 months, only 4 containers had been opened. That it was a rare event to have anything stopped and checked.
What I want to move on to then, Graham, is the long-term economic benefits for the UK.
Yeah, you asked me earlier why the UK left the EU.
You mentioned migration was the major reason, but I'm just thinking about. Well, you let me not assume. Do you think there are long-term economic benefits?
Possibly, but we're very, very, very uncertain. I was going to say the other big reason that people give for voting Brexit, if they're asked, is just regaining control. And that they can see that the EU is drifting into being a United States of Europe, fairly undemocratic organisation. And we've really seen that in the negotiations. You know, the dominance of the unelected commission. And the commissioners, I think, has shocked a lot of people on this side.
The commissioners are appointed by the elected governments.
Yes, but then
you could say the unelected cabinet running the UK. Nobody ever elects a cabinet minister.
Yes, they do. They elect all of them.
No, they don't. They're elected as MPs, which some of the commissioners have previously been elected to different posts, but nobody is elected to being a member of the cabinet.
No, but they're elected as MPs.
Sure,
whereas Barnier and all these people, and Theresa May goes to Brussels to sign off on agreements like last December's joint progress report. She goes and signs off with Juncker. She goes and signs off with a civil servant, not with an elected politician.
Sure, I actually agree with you. I think that there is a democratic deficit in the EU, but I'm not sure that the UK is going about the right way to reclaim that democratic deficit, or whether they're going about that at all, in particular because the quality of democracy in the UK is rather questionable. We have, and I'll come on to it in a moment, the DUP with a minuscule fraction of a percent of the total UK vote being in pole position in the Parliament, and other parties that got dozens of times more votes having either no MPs at all or far fewer.
Oh, come on, William. You know that's exactly how democracy works. That's how democracy works in Ireland.
In fact, it's not.
Where individual independents or Labour Party, all sorts of very small organisations have often had a disproportionate say, because they've got...
No, a disproportionate say is one thing. A disproportionate number of members of Parliament is entirely different, and the DUP gets 20 or 30 times more members of Parliament per vote than, for example, the Green Party in the UK. But nevertheless, I haven't heard the answer from you, and you might be saying it. Are you agreeing that there is no particularly certain economic long-term benefit for the UK from Brexit?
It's uncertain.
It's uncertain. No, that's a fair answer. You don't have to. It may not be known.
It is, but with a free trade agreement, I think there'll be fairly limited short-term losses, and those losses will be made up, over time. What we put into our model about the long term, because we don't know, and we just have to make an assumption in this case, is that any losses in trade with the EU in 2021 due to not having a free trade agreement or a partial free trade agreement, we've assumed that those will be made up over a period of the next 20 years through the negotiation of free trade agreements with other countries, and adjustments with the EU. I mean, I feel that's a pretty cautious assumption, but we're the first people to admit it. It's only an assumption, and one can make.
The one thing that I want to say where I agree with you, and I draw the analogy of I think it was Roosevelt being elected as US president in 1940 on a platform promising not to enter World War II. And there were very strong pressures in the United States and a very strong lobby to keep the United States neutral in World War II. And Roosevelt flipped on his promise and joined World War II. And one of the reasons people were campaigning against it was people said it would cost so much money. And they were right. It cost the United States an enormous toll, not only in money, also in lives. But nobody who was going into World War II, Roosevelt in his position, never promised that they were wrong, never said that it would not cost money or lives to join World War II. He said they should join World War II because it was the right thing to do. And I think by analogy, it would be entirely reasonable to make the argument that even if it cost money, it would be the right thing to do for Brexit, for the UK to go with Brexit. That's an argument that could be made. I may or may not agree with it. But the point is, nobody really made that argument, did they? Everybody campaigning in the referendum campaigned on the basis that the UK would be better off. It was painted on the side of a bus that the NHS would be £350 million per week better off. That's entirely false, isn't it?
No, I think your premise is false, actually, where you say that nobody made that claim. There were two main organisations
But the explicit claim was that hundreds of millions of pounds per week would go to the NHS because it would cost so much less, because the UK would be richer for not being in the UK.
Once again, if I could finish my sentence, there were two organisations campaigning on the pro-Brexit side in the referendum, and the one led by Farage was very clear that even if it cost some money, it was worth it. Farage wanted it once out, and most of his UKIP voters, of which in the previous general election there were 4 million of the voters, and they got no seats at all. And again, that's a normal operation of a first past the post democratic system. But there were a lot of them, and by and large, the UKIP position was they don't like the EU, they want out of it. If it costs the UK a bit of money. So
but for example, The Sun was running articles with pictures of different products and said that flat screen TV would be £50 cheaper when we leave the EU. This product would be so many pounds cheaper when we leave the EU. Do you not think that's storing up resentment when people discover that's not the case and that they're worse off, perhaps?
Well, it may be the case. You don't know that. It depends on what trade agreements we have and what tariff regime that the UK chooses to have in the long run. But let me give you an example on tariffs. For instance, there's an 11% tariff on most clothing coming into the EU, including coming into Ireland. Now, why
that's coming in, for example, from perhaps third world countries where it's made? That's
right. And the main reason for that, as far as I can see, is to protect small clothing manufacturers in Italy, which have been very hard hit by much cheaper clothing coming in from the Far East. And one of the advantages the UK will have outside the EU is that they can go to countries like China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and say, look, we'll let your clothing in tariff-free. There's no reason for us to have tariffs on clothing. And we'd like you to lower your tariffs on things like Scotch whisky, which has something like 150% tariff going into India. But the UK will be able to do that. Clothing will then become cheaper. Flat screen TVs may become cheaper. I don't know. I mean, it all depends how it's negotiated. But it's certainly not unthinkable or improbable that may happen. If it doesn't happen, I don't know what the reaction will be. But I think that the great majority of people, particularly working class people who voted Brexit, weren't voting on marginal changes in standards of living. They really do want out of this organisation, and they do want something done about migration. And I think the failure of the EU and many politicians, including politicians in Ireland. I talked in Ireland during the referendum campaign, and I found complete lack of understanding of why people in the UK would want to vote in favour of Brexit, and therefore they were totally surprised when it happened, because they had such a poor understanding of the reasons for it. We shall see what happens on the economic front. In my view, that there'll be some slight loss of real incomes, perhaps 1% or something, but nothing that's going to be very noticeable. And in the long run, when we're talking about the later years of the next decade, then our expectation is the UK will then start to pull away and be better off. But quite a lot depends here on what happens to migration, because you're often given figures for what might happen to GDP, but you're rarely given figures for what might happen to per capita GDP. And in our expectation...
I see what you mean. So you think a lower population, perhaps, and the same GDP to spread across a lower population, it makes people on average richer?
Yeah, that's right. And our expectation is that the per capita GDP will never be lower than it otherwise would have been. So that there won't be any real loss of living standards. That doesn't mean to say there won't be some losers. Maybe farmers growing leeks and restaurants that depend heavily on East European workers and so on.
Okay, one potential set of losers that I want to get onto is, of course, the people of Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland, part of the UK, is part of the Good Friday Agreement, which makes various guarantees. Are you entirely confident that they can be honoured within your view of Brexit?
Yes, I'm entirely confident that they could be honoured. I'm not entirely confident that they will be easily honoured. I mean, it seems to me that the British side of this is making a complete meal of it, and the Irish side is really playing a hardball in a way that Enda Kenny didn't, for instance. I mean, the hard line from Ireland.
For example?
Well, Enda Kenny, for instance, had Irish civil servants working on the details of an electronic border, and quiet meetings were taking place between civil servants, north and south. I mean, I know some of the civil servants in the north who were involved in those meetings. And Enda Kenny was also keeping Arlene Foster well in touch with what was happening in the EU meetings. He would phone her up and tell her. I think he was taking the view that it was better if everybody knew exactly what was happening. All of that stopped since when Leo Varadkar took over in the middle of last year. Yeah,
and this has been fairly widely reported. Essentially, Leo Varadkar took the view: you broke it, you fix it.
Yes, but Enda Kenny didn't. So this is a political line.
That's a rational view. It would be. And I don't want to.
Well, are you saying Enda Kenny was irrational?
Well, perhaps yes, in the sense that if he was taking responsibility for finding a solution for someone else, then that's probably not the best management strategy.
Well, people like Ray Bassett, who I know quite well, think that the Irish government is playing a very dangerous game here. I mean, they're trying to push the UK into staying in the customs union. But the downside on this, from the Irish point of view, is that this may all fail and there may be no agreement at all. And that's the worst possible outcome for Ireland.
Well, let's just to think down to brass tacks. Hundreds of thousands of people cross the border every day, and that's a matter of getting on a train or getting on a bus or just driving down the road. Are you entirely confident their experience will not be changed?
Oh, individuals, yes. Yeah, I mean, that is clear, and that's been agreed.
Okay, and say, for example, a farmer in County Monaghan wants to sell a load of hay or a few cows to his neighbour a couple of kilometres down the road in County Armagh.
Well, the British proposal is to have an exemption for small traders like that, so that as far as the British are concerned, they don't care about that. It's small beer, and those people can go backwards and forwards without any checks or without any liability for tariffs. Or anything else.
Okay, tariffs are one thing, but standards are another. What about, for example, animal welfare standards, animal veterinary regimes, drugs that animals are given? Is it likely that the conditions, the laws, which are uniform on both sides of the border now, will diverge?
Well, in Northern Ireland, they claim that they aren't uniform. They claim that the animal health standards are actually higher in the north. But nevertheless, the worry that the EU and Dublin have is that perhaps sometime in the future, 5, 10, whatever years ahead, there may be some divergence in standards. I find that very hard to believe. It'd be easy to have equivalence rules here, where the EU say that whatever the animal health standards are in the UK, they will be deemed equivalent to those in the EU and vice versa. The EU already has equivalents, for instance, on Canadian beef and New Zealand lamb. They accept that the standards of farming in New Zealand on raising lamb are always going to be acceptable to the EU. And one can do exactly the same with the UK.
And what about, say, traders who have shops on both sides of the border?
What about them?
Well, will they be able to move their stock from one side of the border to another to meet demand without difficulty?
As far as the UK authorities are concerned, yes. I mean, the UK proposal on this, which was made August last year, so almost 12 months ago now, is an exemption for such people. There would be no problem at all.
An exemption from what exactly?
These things are really on your side of the border. On the EU side, there's much more inflexibility. There's a lot of flexibility on the UK side. I mean, it's commonly said in Ireland that in the referendum, no one was thinking of Ireland or Northern Ireland, and that's true. But as soon as the result came through, the British government, I think, has tried very hard to make sure that there will be as little inconvenience for Ireland, north or south, as possible. The problem is that all proposals are rejected on the UK side, usually with intemperate language. There's a bit of a giveaway here that
Hold on for a second, Graham. Hold on for a second. One of the proposals that was reported in The Guardian was that Irish people would be allowed to cross the border without hindrance if they pre-registered with the British government. If you had a situation whereby it was proposed, say, that English people would be allowed to travel freely within England as long as they pre-registered with the French government or the German government, what do you think the reaction in the Sun or the Daily Mail would be?
I don't think that is the proposal at all.
This was floated. It was shut down pretty quickly. But that type of proposal coming out seems that's indicative of a complete misunderstanding of how Ireland works.
Both sides have proposed that the common travel area, which has been in place since 1921 between Ireland and the UK, will be continued unchanged, and that has now been agreed and is written into the withdrawal agreement. So I just don't accept the premises of I don't remember that, and that doesn't seem to be the case at all.
I'll put a link to the article in the show notes for this podcast. But if, as you were saying, everything is going to be as before, in particular with standards and so forth, so that people can trade, doesn't that make a nonsense of this idea that the UK are going to be freed from the oppressive hand of Brussels, where they must follow product regulations that are set in Brussels? And in the US, there's what's called the California effect. And California has a population of about 50 million, which is about 1/7 of the total size of the US. But it's by far the largest state by population. And the effect is that when the California legislature sets minimum standards for products or industries or whatever, that in effect, that is imposed on the rest of the United States, because companies don't want to bother running to two separate standards. They just run to the California standards, and that meets all the other standards. Isn't it likely that's going to happen with the UK as well? Anybody who wants to export is going to have to meet EU standards anyway.
Absolutely. We have to meet American standards to export to America, or Chinese standards to export to China, and EU standards to export to the EU.
And those standards will effectively be imposed on the UK.
Any weakening of regulation, particularly on food safety and animal safety, why on earth would there be?
That leaves you then wondering exactly why you're leaving.
Well, I've given you the main reasons why they're leaving. And
that seems to shoot down one of them. I accept you say the migration one. I'm not sure that's everybody in the industries would agree with you, but that does seem to shoot down one of the two major reasons for leaving, doesn't it?
No, not at all. The control thing was a much wider one than that. It's just having a democratic control, that the people making the decisions on everything in across the country would be those elected by the electorate of the UK.
I actually agree with you on that, and I agree that was the reason why people were voting the way they did. You're an academic at the University of Cambridge. You're an extremely well-educated person. Are you confident that they were correct in that? Or perhaps Boris Johnson, when he was the Brussels correspondent of the Times, when he was just fabricating stories day after day about regulations on bendy bananas or whatever, entirely untrue. Do you think that had an impact on that feeling?
Look, this is a kind of favourite claim of of Remainers and people outside the UK, to focus on people like Boris Johnson.
But it's true that Boris Johnson was a correspondent for the Times in Brussels. He was later fired for writing a false story, different false stories, for fabricating a quotation. But he fabricated a whole series of stories, the intent of which was that the EU was some incredibly bureaucratic, micromanaging, ludicrous institution.
Well, I don't agree with many things that Boris Johnson says, but that particular quote strikes me as not far off the mark. But look,
But he fabricated a whole series of stories which became tabloid fodder.
I have very little time for Boris Johnson. I certainly wouldn't have made him foreign secretary.
No, but address the point that the stories that he fabricated and other stories in that vein, entirely untrue, became tabloid fodder and fed that air of Euroscepticism.
Yes, I think they did. But what you're not aware of, and what most Remainers aren't aware of are the lies and deceptions on the other side. It was a dreadful campaign in which there was a lot of lies and deception. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those lies were coming from the UK Treasury. I mean, myself and colleagues at Cambridge and at Ulster University in Belfast are the only people anywhere who completely replicated the analysis of the Treasury. We found huge flaws in that analysis, always on the same side.
Sure, but the bottom line is, Graham, those analyses weren't believed by the electorate. The electorate rejected that at the polls, and they accepted the arguments of the Brexiteers, be they in the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or predominantly in UKIP. And those people said that there was no question of Britain leaving the single market.
You're starting to get touch hysterical now, if I may say so.
No, but it's absolutely true. People like David Hannon and
lies on both sides, but your
yes, that's absolutely true. Graham, hang on for a second. Graham, there are never so many lies told as before an election, during a war, or after a hunt. But the bottom line is the electorate believed one side and not the other, and it is.
How do you know that?
Well, by the way they express their votes.
Well, I think if the Treasury hadn't lied, I mean, look, the Treasury is a government organisation. We pay these people to do honest work. We know they were lying to us, and they're continuing to lie, by the way, and exaggerate right up until the present.
You have Graham. You have far more detail on that than I do. But it is.
Look, let me
go ahead.
There's no point in having this interview if you're answering your own question. I think the Remain vote would have been much smaller if it hadn't have been for what's called Project Fear. The fact that day after day during the campaign, the Treasury, the OECD, the IMF, the Bank of England, and many others were saying that this will be economically disastrous. The Treasury, for instance, said we'll have an immediate recession, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer said he would have to have an emergency budget in which he'd have to put up taxes immediately if the vote went in favour of Brexit. That was, of course, completely untrue. It was just to scare the voters. But it may well have scared quite a lot of voters. The fact that the vote was as narrow as it was, I think, was probably due to that huge weight of economic evidence, nearly all of which was, embarrassingly flawed in my view.
Sure, but the bottom line is that... Hold on a second. Graham, I believe you. I understand what you're saying, and I know that it is substantially true. I might argue around the margins, but I know that it's substantially true. But the bottom line is that's the equivalent of a losing election manifesto. They didn't win the election. They didn't win the referendum. The referendum was won by the Brexiteers, who promised that there was no question of Britain leaving the single market.
No, they did not promise that. Absolutely not.
That was explicitly said by leading Brexiteers.
They also promised that we would leave the customs union and negotiate our own trade agreements.
No, they said that they would be able to negotiate trade agreements without leaving the.
That was the second out of 5 priorities. See, a lot of this just isn't true.
Absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
Yeah, but because only a madman would actually leave the market.
I mean, Norway, Switzerland, all of these countries have complete free trade with the EU. And
the Norwegian option, the EEA option, I think that it might be initially attractive for some business people.
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal.
But to repeat, absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
Yeah, but I'm going to fade that down, but that's a whole series of Brexiteers, including Michael Gove, Nigel Farage, Daniel Hannon, Aaron Banks and others, saying that Britain would stay in the EEA or stay in the single market.
No, sorry, I didn't hear Farage say that. It certainly wasn't Farage's position. He wants out of everything. He was saying just the opposite.
He was saying that the UK would get the same position as Norway and Switzerland, who are in the single market.
I would do that through a free trade agreement, as I've already said. Look, William, get over it. There was a completely legitimate and legal vote. There were lies on both sides. I think the lies on the Remain side were more important because they were deceptions from official government organisations. I think there's really a constitutional issue there that we'll have to return to when all this dies down.
I think you might be. I think you might be correct, but we have gone on very long on that, Graham. I appreciate your time and your explaining things. You are Graham Gudgeon, an associate of the Centre for Business Research and at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge, also Chief Economic Advisor for Policy Exchange in London. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Good to talk to you, William. All the best. Bye-bye now.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references for everything we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and follow Briefing for Brexit at Briefing for Brexit. That's the number 4. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.here'show.ie. And just to remind you, there's a link to my Patreon account there as well. So if you'd like to support the podcast and help make it more frequent with more research, I'd really appreciate that. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.